I've always played piano. I grew up in Racine. I have an older sister. She's a year older than me. When she was probably 6 or 7, she took piano lessons, and I wanted to do whatever she did. So I followed her to the piano studio, and eventually she quit, and I was playing, and then eventually I quit, but I kept playing, and I always played, and I fell in love with some of the 78 RPM records that my father had by boogie woogie piano players like Meade Lux Lewis and Albert Ammons. And so I started learning little boogie on the piano, not for any particular reason, mostly boredom, I suspect. And then I kind of stumbled along that way until I was like 12 or 13, at which time my father found a teacher for me. And every Saturday he would drive me the half hour to Milwaukee to take lessons from a gentleman named Mr. Milton Merritz, who eventually taught me how to read a little music and understand a little harmony. And that's basically how I physically got along in terms of the music I was listening to. When I was 12 or 13, I discovered Horace Silver. When I was 15, discovered Ray Charles. In 1957 or 58, whenever they made the record, The Hottest New Group in Jazz, I discovered Lambert, Hendricks, and Ross. Earlier than that, I discovered Dave Brubeck, George Shearing. That's what I was listening to until later on, when I really lucked up upon Miles Davis's Kind of Blue, and pretty much everything opened up for me. Those are my early years.
You know, it's a little bit of a challenge for me to describe my early years, because the fact is, when most of us are asked to recall our childhoods, we're not actually, nobody can keep us in check. Nobody can corroborate our story. And I happen to be telling the story of my own childhood with the only witness who could tell me if I'm right or not. You know, so in many ways, that story that Ben tells you is a little bit of a preface to my childhood, because that was kind of the music that was around in the house when I was growing up. So I think that really boogie woogie and jazz and blues and the music that my father was making when I was growing up, those were the early sounds that I heard. Also, as a young boy, you know, the sounds out of Minneapolis, the Petersons and the company that my father was keeping there was very influential for me. But I was also a big pop music person. So, you know, I loved Michael Jackson. I loved Prince. I loved Huey Lewis and the News. I loved Genesis. I loved the sort of popular music of the 80s when I was a boy. And I am of an age when technology started to interact with the way people made music in a more common way. So I learned how to play music by recording. And today that's very common. You know, today people have computers that have the software that comes pre-installed on your computer. But at the time, I was just really at the vanguard of that. I was like, especially to be growing up in Wisconsin and Madison, no other kids knew how to really record themselves. So as I was learning to listen to music, I was also learning to play it and to record it. And I kind of developed this way of hearing music that basically informs what I do today. I would listen to music and then try to figure out all of the pieces that were happening in it: the drums, the bass, the keyboard, the guitar, the way it was recorded and it sounded. And that became a big part of my early development also. So I spent a lot of time alone in a room making music by myself.
I can corroborate all of that. When I first got to Wisconsin, it was 1961, and I played in little bands. I had a little jazz trio of my own. I was mostly just interested in jazz, again, Horace Silver, these kinds of people. I did, as is widely reported, with Steve Miller and Boz Scaggs into a little college band. It was called the Ardells, and it was really important in the sense that they played very straight up, very serious blues, T-Bone Walker kind of blues, Jimmy Reed kind of blues, and I had never played that. I mean, the closest I had gotten would have been trying to copy Ray Charles's Wurlitzer piano part to What Did I Say or something. And having met Steve and Boz, I got to play blues as well as jazz, and that continued for some time. Uh, I went to graduate school in England in 1967 in American Studies, which is like history or sociology. And while there, Steve and the rest of his band had moved from San Francisco to London to record. And so while I was in graduate school in England, it was in Brighton, I also went up to London from time to time and recorded with Steve and Boz and kind of fell into the record business that way because they eventually left, went back to San Francisco, but I was there for another couple of years. And so during that period, I made friends with some British musicians, a British engineer named Glyn Johns, and I got some experience in the recording industry. And then when I graduated in 1971, instead of going into academics, which at the time wasn't an option for me, I moved to Los Angeles and got in the record business. And that took about 6 months of phone calls and knocking on doors. And at the time, the record business was really wide open. The business was smaller, much, much smaller than it is today. There were a lot of very interesting characters in the business who had come up from selling records out of the trunks of their cars or being promotion men, not the lawyers and accountants that you have today in the business. And it was a very relaxed, a very open, very creative kind of environment, I thought. I, however, discovered that my wife, Judy, at the time, didn't like living in Los Angeles. And so after I got my first record contract, she and I moved back to Madison, Wisconsin, where we had met in college and lived here ever since, really. And then I taught at the university for a little bit. And one of the courses I taught was on the record business. So I started to look at the record business with more of a careful and perhaps jaundiced eye. And I started to think about what kind of business it was, what sorts of things mattered, who determined what music lived and what music disappeared, all those kind of things. And I'd have to say that the business that I discovered in the 60s, by the time I started teaching in 72 or 3, had changed dramatically. It had become very corporate, very driven by units of sales as opposed to cultural history, which is what, of course, we thought it was in the 60s. And then it just progressed apace. I mean, from there till today, it's just been one constant long march toward marketing and efficiencies in production and distribution. And basically, whereas in the late 60s, the young artists were demanding creative control, today, the corporations, if they ever sign a young artist, demand what they call a 360-degree deal, which means that not only do they not have creative control by and large, but a percentage of everything they generate, whether it's t-shirt sales or concert tickets, goes back to the record company. So it's an entirely different industry than it was when I got in.
Often think that if Ben had been in car sales, I would be selling cars today. He's a very compelling guy, a very seductive guy who cares deeply about what he cares about. And so the people around him also seemed to care about what they cared about. And I just wanted to be part of that, whatever that was. I was drawn to music very early, but I'm not sure if I was drawn to it because I had some particular gift, or it's just I wanted to be in the room where these characters were hanging out. They just seemed like so much fun to be around. So I sort of did anything I could to get into the business, I guess, which meant to be able to play music with the cast of characters that would come around, or who I would get to go on the road and visit. So I don't think I was aware of a career until much later. To be honest with you, I don't even think it occurred to me that I chose to be a musician. I mean, people have asked me that my whole life. Why did you choose? When did you choose? I don't even think I realized it until coronavirus hit. And I realized, wait a minute, some of these people around me have jobs. And it turns out I don't have a job. Turns out I don't have a retirement account. It turns out I don't have anything. I guess I chose to have a career in music, but it never occurred to me until right now that that was happening, because it was just basically keeping pace with what was around me, trying to be like my dad. That was the family business in a lot of ways. In terms of the people who came through, I mean, so I guess Steve Miller came through the house when I was little, and Boz and all those people. But, for me, the deeper memories are like Clyde Stubblefield, the drummer who lived in Madison, would come to the house. Richard Davis, the bass player who was in Madison. And then Phil Upchurch and Ricky Peterson, all the Petersons would come through. And anybody Ben was working with. I remember one time I came home and Don Grolnick, the great piano player, was there because he was on tour with James Taylor. I mean, there would just always be, it was about musicians. It wasn't about celebrities, it wasn't about fame. It was musicians would come. And the incredible thing is that 9 times out of 10, if a musician came into the house, they would end up in our little music room jamming with us. And it was never framed in terms of being a professional career or, anything like that. It was jamming. All of these people would come in and kind of inevitably start hanging out and playing music. So, like I say, there was nothing about what my dad was doing that suggested that it was a professional decision in any way. It was a lifestyle. It was a point of view. And I wanted to be a part of that point of view.
I met Richie Cole, I think in 1978, in a recording studio where I had hired Phil Woods to play a solo on a recording I was making. And Phil showed up with a small entourage of guys. And Richie later informed me that he was among that entourage. I hadn't realized that. I'm sure I said hi to him, but I was so involved in the recording session that we didn't talk then. But when I really met Richie was when he came through town with Eddie Jefferson a few years later. And I hung out with him. I had known Eddie. I met Eddie in 1976, working on a television program that I was producing. And so Eddie more or less introduced me to Richie, and we fell in with one another. We very shortly thereafter started sharing a booking agent together, a California booking agent. And of course, naturally, if you share a booking agent, you wind up playing on the same gigs. So we started playing gigs together, and we eventually wound up traveling together, driving cross country in his van together, having lots and lots of adventures, both musical and extracurricular. He was a wild character and a wonderful guy. And a very old school guy in that he was just all about the road and living this life that musicians had lived for decades. And he really wanted to be part of that. And in a way, he was kind of a window to that world for me. I mean, he lived it 110%. And of course, he's passed away now, and he passed away rather young, frankly. And I think it's because of the hard life that he lived. But while he was living, he lived all of it. He didn't leave anything on the table. And what can I say? I mean, it was maybe 40 years of gigs and hanging out with Richie and knowing him and traveling with him. And my favorite Richie Cole story, I was reminded of recently. Leo and myself and Judy, my wife, were in the airport in Minneapolis on a moving walkway. We were headed out toward the gate. And coming toward us in the opposite direction was Richie Cole. And we were going to cross on this moving walkway, but Richie, and this is classic Richie Cole behavior, jumped over the railing and came onto our side of the walkway and hung out for a while. So that's my Richie Cole story. Well, Billy's, it's a classic question from Billy because Billy is that performer that you really turn to for spontaneity. I personally am not a typical producer in the studio, and Leo is actually much more experienced in that because he crafts music from very commercial and filmic music and pop music and all this stuff. My orientation has always been uh, trying to find a lucky accident in a jazz performance. So I tend to take first takes. I tend to set it up in such a way that the musician doesn't necessarily know everything he's going to need to accomplish the task. So he's got to kind of invent it as he goes. And as a matter of fact, the story I told about meeting Richie in the studio with Phil Woods is a classic example. Phil Woods came in the studio. He walked in, he took his horn out of the case, and as he did that, I put the master tape up and was playing him the song that he was going to play the solo on. And he said to me, look, why don't I just go out to the room and warm up and you can get a sound on my horn? And I said, fine. And so Phil walked out into the studio. We rolled the tape back to the beginning. He put on some earphones and the tape just rolled and he started playing along with it. And he executed it perfectly and completely spontaneously. And I said, that was great, Phil, let's do another take. And he said, sure, baby, whatever you want. And so we did another take and it was good, but it missed something. So I said, well, let's do another one. So we maybe did 3 or 4 takes and we wound up, of course, keeping the take that he had done before he even knew what he was doing. So that's my favorite kind of capturing a moment.
Well, first of all, life in Brooklyn. Okay. I moved to New York, which was kind of like the holy grail for me. I moved there in my late 20s. I spent quite a bit of time in Madison before I moved here because I was really concerned that if I moved to New York, that I would have to choose a specific lane and really focus on it. I mean, New York is filled with the top of the top of craftsmen and practitioners in every area. If you want to play drums, like I like to play drums, the greatest drummers in the world live here. If you want to be a recording engineer, the greatest recording engineers are here, and so on and so on. So what I liked about being in Madison, putting in my time in Madison, was I never had to make those kinds of choices. I just kind of had a chance to develop in all areas at the same time. And when I finally did move to New York, what I discovered was that that time I had put in Madison had prepared me beautifully for the career that I sort of, I guess, career for the work I ended up finding, because I like to do a lot of different kinds of things. I like a broad range of styles, and I tend to be pretty self-contained and work alone often. At the same time, one of the things I did in Madison, growing up following in Ben's footsteps, was call musicians into a room and learn how to interact with musicians and record with them and think about who the right person is for the gig and what, try to bring out the best in people. And so when I moved to New York, what I discovered was I was kind of perfectly suited to do music for picture, for film and advertising. And I didn't even know that writing music for commercials or even really for TV was a job. I wouldn't have known how to go looking for it if I had tried. But I had this one credit that I brought with me when I came to New York. I had produced a song that was used in this film called The Motorcycle Diaries. And that song won an Academy Award right before I moved here. So I moved here basically with an Oscar to my name, which meant that everybody that I met with thought that I must be a film guy. And I started getting offers to do film and TV work. So that's kind of how I fell into it. And what I discovered is, you have to be fast, you have to be flexible, and more than anything, I think you have to be personable. And I think that, speaking to your question about advice for future composers, I think talent is a given. I mean, what I discovered when I moved to New York was I never got in a room with somebody that I didn't think was talented. Everybody was super talented, most of them way more talented than me. But you have to have a certain kind of disposition and a willingness to, as we all do in music anyway, kind of take a lot of abuse and keep getting up and going at it as if, you know, your life depended on it and your heart was totally in it every time. And that is a challenging thing to do. And New York certainly demanded that of me, that you just wake up every day and just try to wrestle that bear down again. And if you don't get it, as my dad says, sometimes you eat the bear, sometimes the bear eats you, but you wake up the next day and you go at it again. And that's not technical. That's not something that you learn through any kind of musical technique. That's a kind of personal technique for survival. In terms of the creative process, it's very, very interesting. I mean, I refer to writing music for picture as musical mission impossible. You have very limited time and often limited resources, and you've got to solve some almost impossible problem through music. And it's that's what makes it exciting, you know, and keeps you on your toes. My wife said to me the other day about her job, she said, you know, I feel like you should always be a little nervous before you go in to do your job. And I agree. I still get just a little nervous before I do most of the jobs that I do. And I think that's a good sign. I'm still, after all these years, not totally convinced that I'm going to be able to pull it off. And, you know, I grew up hanging out by the side of the stage and then playing on stage with Ben and Billy, who would walk off stage every night. Every night I played a gig with Ben Sidran and Billy Peterson. They walk off stage, look at each other, and they say these words to each other: "Fooled them again." So I think that I still kind of follow in that with that philosophy of, you know, you just fool them. You just go in there and you fool them. Okay, now to speak to the question about the Third Story podcast. Well, I have a podcast not unlike this kind of project, where I talk to creative people, musicians, about their careers and lives. It came out of two experiences. One was recording in studios where I would meet a musician for the first time when they came in. And I discovered that one of my favorite parts of a recording studio experience with a new musician was not only the creative part of it, but was the getting to know you part of it. So I had started to think, boy, it would really be fun to capture that part of the experience. And then obviously, you know, Ben did that too in the 80s. He interviewed people. So he interviewed Miles and Dizzy and Max Roach and some of the greatest practitioners of jazz. And so I knew that that was a thing that you could do. You could call somebody up and say, hey, I'd really like to talk to you. Would you be interested? And as I'm sure you have found, people love to talk about themselves. So I found it was a pleasure to get to know people that way. Who's it for and what's the purpose? It's hard to know. I don't know my life. I don't know my purpose. You know, I think it's just to capture the moment, capture these people and these conversations, and capture a moment in time that hopefully will be of some service in the future also. And finally, who's the old guy now? Well, Ben Sidran. He's old. And we made a song in honor of his 77th birthday, which was in mid-August, called "Who's the Old Guy Now," which we had started to play with earlier in the year. The last time we were able to see each other was in February. We were hanging out together, and I don't know how it came up, if he had the idea, what it was, but we were sitting at the piano. It's even before that. It was last fall on the road. We were talking about, it'd be funny if it was about this or about that, and I had some ideas, he had some ideas, and it really, although it's about him and it is his song, it was the first in a series of songs that we have started to record together. I don't want to talk too much about it because I know you have another question coming, but the first in a series of songs that we have been working on together that are truly collaborative, really co-writes in the Lennon-McCartney sense of it, where we're just kind of feeding off of each other and writing these songs together.
Well, in many ways, these are really exciting times for me and Leo. As he said, we're starting to work together closer. The business has changed dramatically, and whereas originally I was pretty well informed, now I would say he's better informed than I am, which is appropriate because he's more on top of things than I am. We, for whatever reason, have been fortunate. We really enjoy hanging out together and doing work together, and we have kind of similar senses of humor. And
Mm.
so in some ways, I don't think it really matters what we put our minds to. I think whatever it would be fun, it would be productive, it would be creative. We've learned to do what I like to quote Henry Miller as saying, we beat our anguish into product. That's what Miller said when he's talking about book writing. Uh, well, it's not exactly how I think of what I'm doing, but I take an idea and I develop the idea and then I move on. So that's going to continue. And I suspect I'll be more and more in league working with Leo in the past, if only because the infrastructure is not going to be there in a year from now to just travel around and go to the same old places with the same old people. I think that we're going to have to go through a period here of years and maybe 5 years where this whole thing gets built back up again. It's going to take a while. So that's kind of the future for me in terms of who I owe thanks to. I
Mm.
mean, obviously hundreds of people, but if there's one person, it would quite clearly have to be my wife, Judy, who's been with me for 52 years and has really kind of set the sails for this particular journey. I think I personally would have been just sailing left and right through the uncharted waters on my own. But she's really given my life and Leo's life, and by extension, our family's life, a direction. So certainly without her being part of this, I suspect none of what happened would have happened.
You know, I appreciate Ben's ability to paint a sunny picture of the future, and he's not wrong. I think I don't disagree with him that it is exciting, because it's exciting right now in the sense that we really do not know what is going to happen, and that is exciting. But clearly, there is a major change in the business. I mean, as I guess as Ben says, what's next for me and him? Yeah, well, we're going to keep making these songs. I mean, I don't know if they're going to get sold or given away or passed around or what. I mean, we will continue to work together. That is unquestionable. And opportunity reveals itself in many ways. We have always sort of been motivated by these ideas and these schemes and these plans, and whether that means booking a tour or going into the studio or coming up with some concept or another, packaging thing, marketing thing, performance opportunity, it's all kind of the same. And we will definitely do that regardless of what the business um, holds. But in terms of the record business, I mean, we saw that kind of collapse. Now we're seeing the record business was sort of replaced in the last decade by live gigs. Once the business of selling records collapsed, the kind of mantra was, well, you make your money on tour. Well, that's over, and it's not just over this year. I mean, the entire infrastructure is being dismantled, and it doesn't just come back. So we don't know. There is something I've been really curious about for a long time, and that is whether or not music and culture, popular music, are regional anymore. And something gives me a sense this may give the sort of local semi-professional musicians an opportunity to step forward and let music exist in the community, even in a sort of non-commercial way. Because there are so many professional musicians who will not be able to be professional musicians when this is over. There's new business opportunities, I suppose. You know, there are people who are making money. There are actually people who are making money on Spotify downloads. I mean, if you get or streams, if you get enough streams, if you make a song that's popular enough that you get streams on Spotify or YouTube, you make a little bit of a living. So I guess there are people out there that are doing it. But in terms of the future, I get the sense that in my father's generation, more and more people became professionally involved in the music business. And in my generation, it may start to diminish again. That's my honest feeling about it. I will be amazed if I make it through my whole life hanging on to this sinking ship. That's what I sort of see it as. I mean, it's just, I feel like it will be a miracle if I get through it. And this is the only thing I ever do. I think I probably will, but I don't know if another generation will come up and really figure out how to make a living like this. I don't see it. Sorry to be dark. It is exciting to know that we're living in historic times. That's true, to me anyway. And in terms of thanking people, so many of the people I mentioned already, Ben, the Peterson family, my mother, absolutely, for providing that space for me. So many of the musicians I met throughout my childhood and even in my journey when I came here, who have been nothing but encouraging. I mean, all the musicians we talked about. Phil Woods came through the house and played with me and was encouraging. Everybody who came to play was always very encouraging. I never had a musician discourage me. And so in general, I think I have to just thank the entire community of jazz musicians who I came across when I was growing up. James Farber, the recording engineer, and Jorge Drexler, my friend who I did the Oscar song with. So many people to thank and be thankful for.